By early 1943, the F4U Corsair had earned a nickname that made even the most eager new pilots hesitate at the foot of the ladder, the Ensign Eliminator. To outsiders, the name sounded almost comical, like a bit of dark humor tossed around between fuel checks and coffee. But to the men who actually had to strap into the beast, the nickname wasn't a joke, it was a warning. A whispered reminder that the Corsair didn't just demand skill, it demanded obedience. And if you didn't understand its moods, its quirks, its savage instincts, the aircraft would kill you faster than any Cero could. The strange thing was that no one doubted the Corsair's potential. It wasn't an underdog or a flawed experiment. If anything, it was too good a fighter that had been designed for performance first and pilots second. Its engine, the massive Pratt, Whitney, R2800, double Wasp, was the same monstrous powerhouse that sat inside the P-47 Thunderbolt. But the Thunderbolt had a long, sturdy fuselage and thick wings to help tame its brutality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Corsair didn't. The Corsair was essentially a huge engine bolted to a tiny cockpit with wings bent like a ghoul's legs, a warhorse with the temperament of a bucking mule, a purebred racer handed to a stable of farmhands, and the pilots who had to fly it. Most were barely in their 20s. The first thing every new Corsair pilot learned was that visibility was non-existent. When the aircraft sat on the ground, its enormous three-bladed propeller and huge radial engine lifted the nose skyward like a rearing stallion. Pilots joked nervously that they could hide a destroyer under that nose and never notice until they collided with it. Operational reports described it in more formal language: forward visibility, severely restricted, ground taxi recommended via S-turn pattern, translated into pilot speak. Weave left and right like a drunken snake, or you'll run over your own ground crew. Even landing officers on carriers hated the Corsair. They'd strain their eyes trying to judge the moment those ghoul wings crossed the deck edge, praying the pilot didn't flare too high or drift too low. The Corsair didn't reward subtlety. It punished it. Then there was the torque swing. The R2800 engine produced more raw power than any Navy fighter had ever handled before. And the moment the throttle pushed forward, all that force twisted the entire aircraft fiercely to one side. On takeoff, if the pilot wasn't ready with counter-rudder, the Corsair would veer off the runway so quickly it looked like a mechanical suicide attempt. Many young pilots had their first flight in the Corsair end, with the aircraft facing sideways in the grass, prop blades bent, egos shattered. Veteran pilots learned to tame it, but even they admitted something uncomfortable. The Corsair didn't take off. It lunged. And if you weren't ready for that lunge, if you hesitated for even a fraction of a second, you found yourself wrestling the heaviest, angriest beast in the Pacific. And then there was the landing bounce. Good pilots feared it. Bad pilots experienced it. Excellent pilots pretended it never happened to them. The Corsair's long landing gear, needed for that massive propeller, made it behave like a spring-loaded trap. Touchdown too hard, too soft, too early, too late, it didn't matter. The plane would hit the deck and then jump back into the air, sometimes 10, 15, even 20 feet. It wasn't unusual to watch a Corsair bounce once, wobble, bounce again, stall, and then skid sideways into the barrier. Ground crews joked. The Corsair didn't land. It negotiated terms. One Marine pilot summed it up better. You don't fly the Corsair onto the runway. You survive it. Carrier landings were even worse. One bounce on a pitching deck spelled disaster. It was no surprise the Navy initially rejected the Corsair from carrier use altogether, handing it off to Marine squadrons on land bases. To many, that felt like defeat. To others, it was relief. Despite all the drama, experienced pilots knew the truth. At speed, the Corsair was untouchable. Above 250 knots, it was graceful, eager, alive. It rolled sharply, climbed aggressively, and dove like a hawk with talons out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was everything below 200 knots. At low speed, especially right after takeoff or at the bottom of a dive, when a pilot needed responsiveness the most, the Corsair felt sluggish, heavy, almost reluctant. Pilots said it felt like the plane was stuck in deep mud. The engine roared, the propeller spun, the gauges climbed, but the aircraft hesitated just for a moment, as if trying to decide whether it felt like flying today. And in the Pacific, a moment was enough time to die. Japanese Asahi M0s, with their feather-light controls and effortless low-speed handling, capitalized on that hesitation every chance they got. If a Corsair tried to climb away too slowly, the Zero was right there, closing in, guns warming. One pilot described it like this: you'd slam the throttle forward expecting a punch. What you got felt more like a Politshove. Another, it's like the plane didn't want to accelerate until it had a cup of coffee first. And another, it won't bite. I tell it to go and it thinks about it. By mid-1943, the complaints had become almost standardized. It lags, it hesitates, it won't bite when I throttle up. Acceleration is delayed, feels heavy at the bottom of a dive. Climb out after takeoff is dangerously sluggish. Every debriefing board heard the same thing. Every maintenance tent heard the same thing. Every pilot scribbled the same words in his notebook, and the most troubling part, they were all correct. The Corsair was built for speed, strength, and brutal firepower. But in dogfighting, moments mattered, milliseconds mattered. The ability to leap into action the instant a pilot shoved the throttle mattered. And the Corsair simply didn't. Not at low speed. Not when it counted. Engineers knew the Corsair's propeller, a huge Hamilton standard, 3-bladed unit, was optimized for high-speed efficiency, not low-speed acceleration. That was fine for racing. Fine for climbing above clouds, fine for diving attacks, but not fine when a Zero was trying to slip behind you as you cloud upward at 120 knots. The Corsair's massive propeller blades were almost too efficient designed to take advantage of the airflow they would receive at high speed, not the airflow they needed at low speed. In simpler terms, the Corsair wanted to go fast before it felt like going fast. A vicious paradox. And even worse, the aircraft's giant engine produced so much torque that small changes in prop efficiency created enormous handling differences. The Navy's official solution? Tactical adjustment, pilot adaptation, operational experience. In other words, fly better. Pilot after pilot tried, pilot after pilot failed, and the Corsair's reputation majestic. In theory, murderous in practice grew darker with each incident. Which finally brings us to that small, humid, sweltering maintenance tent on a forgotten atoll halfway between everywhere and nowhere. The kind of place where aircraft came in beaten, oil-streaked, and pockmarked with bullet holes, where tents flapped in the salty wind, where maintenance crews worked barefoot in the heat because boots stuck to the sand, where time didn't matter but survival did. Inside that tent worked a quiet marine mechanic named Corporal Frank Calder, a man who never raised his voice, never sought attention, and rarely slept more than 4 hours at a time. His hands were always blackened with grease. His shirt was always damp with sweat, and his mind was always working. Calder was the sort of mechanic who could hear an engine cough once and diagnose the problem within seconds. He'd grown up fixing farm equipment, broken tractors, old cargo transports, anything with moving parts. He wasn't book-taught. He was instinct-taught. And unlike the factory engineers, he didn't care about paperwork, procedures, or theoretical limitations. He cared about the pilots whose lives depended on the machines he touched. And lately, those pilots had been coming back angry, frustrated, sometimes scared, always saying the same thing: "It won't bite." Calder listened, Calder watched, Calder thought, and something began to form in his mind. A possibility he knew he wasn't supposed to consider. A forbidden trick, whispered in mechanic circles, ignored by engineers, dismissed by officers, and banned in every manual the Navy had ever printed. Propeller blade bending, a tiny change, almost invisible, but enough to change the air's angle hitting the blade, enough to change the thrust curve, enough to change everything. He knew what the manual said. He knew the consequences of getting it wrong. He knew a bent blade could rip an engine apart at full RPM. But he also knew something else. Pilots were dying. And if the Navy wasn't going to fix the Corsair's worst flaw, someone else had to try. Someone like a quiet marine mechanic on a lonely Pacific atoll. So that night, long after the pilots had fallen asleep and the sea breeze had finally cooled the air, Corporal Frank Calder walked into the tent, rolled up his sleeves, and prepared to do something no manually, aloud. The sun was already cooking the metal skin of every Corsair on the line by the time Corporal Frank Calder ducked into the maintenance tent. Inside, the air felt thick enough to chew. Tools clattered somewhere in the back. A generator hummed. Someone cursed at a stripped bolt. But Calder didn't notice any of that. Not today. He sat on an upside-down crate, still wearing the same oil-stained uniform from the previous night, staring at the carburetor spread out in front of him like the guts of a steel animal. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, massaging away the fatigue. He wasn't tired from work, he was tired from thinking. For weeks he'd watched pilots limp their Corsairs back home, shaking their heads, complaining about the same thing. The damn thing won't stab when I gun it. It floats when I need a kick. It stalls when I need teeth. Calder knew the Rizzo's 1800 engine better than most men knew their wives. It was a masterpiece, an angry masterpiece, but even masterpieces had weaknesses. The Corsair's problem wasn't raw horsepower. The Ardor's 1800 had more than enough of that. It wasn't a lack of airflow. It wasn't cooling. It wasn't fuel flow. Everything worked as designed, but as designed wasn't good enough for war. And for the pilots, especially the new ones, the hesitation could be the single second between climbing out alive or never climbing out again. Calder leaned over the open carburetor, running a finger across the throttle butterfly. He moved the linkage back and forth. Smooth, clean, too clean. He frowned. A Corsair needed a controlled explosion of fuel-air mixture when the pilot slammed the throttle forward. The stock accelerator pump delivered that burst, but only up to a point. If the pilot advanced the throttle too fast, the system simply couldn't keep up, so the engine hesitated. Just for a second that a zero pilot could turn into an obituary. Calder mumbled to himself. It needs more punch, more jump when the throttle hits. He searched through the racks of parts, picking up tubes, springs, clamps, anything that might spark an idea. He wasn't authorized to modify anything. No one was. Marine mechanics followed manuals the way priests followed scripture. But Calder had reached a point beyond caring about regulations. He had seen too many pilots die with untouched fuel still sloshing in their tanks, too many letters written home. Too many holes in the ready room, where chairs no longer needed to be filled. He dragged a stool closer and began assembling a crude diagram on the table, using scattered parts, hoses for lines, bolts for valves, washers for carburetor throats. The airflow model wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. He visualized the engine gulping for fuel during rapid throttle bursts. The accelerator pump delivered a single squirt, but the supercharger lagged behind that fuel burst. Pressure spikes, fuel-starving pockets, then the dreaded hesitation. Unless, Calder picked up a brass jet the size of his thumbnail. What if you get more fuel in sooner, but only for the first split second? It was a stupid idea. It was a reckless idea. And it was exactly the kind of idea that saved pilots' lives. By mid-morning, Calder had stripped the accelerator pump, adjusted the displacement rod, and swapped in a modified jet that wasn't designed for this engine. He had also filed it down very carefully to widen the aperture by just a hair. Too much fuel, and he'd flood the cylinders. Too little, and he'd gain nothing. He showed his work to no one, especially not Gunny Haskins, his section chief, a man whose eyebrows alone had court-martial authority. Calder reassembled the carburetor with the kind of precision only obsession can produce. His hands didn't shake. They burned with purpose. After lunch, he installed the carburetor on an F4U whose pilot was still asleep in a tent nearby. The propeller blades winked in the sunlight as he double-checked every line and bolt. When he was satisfied, no. When he was absolutely certain, he waved over a plane captain. "Give me a hand," Calder said, sliding onto the wing and reaching for the starter control. The engine coughed once, twice, and then the R2 1800 roared alive with the subtle violence of a beast waking up angry. Calder's heart thudded. This was the moment. He pushed the throttle forward. Hard. The engine didn't lag. It didn't hesitate. It snarled. Instantly, Calder blinked, then frowned, then advanced the throttle again, this time from idle to combat power in one violent shove. Again, the response was immediate. Too immediate. The engine surged forward like it had been starved for days and someone had just dropped a steak in front of it. He stepped back, adrenaline rushing through him. Holy hell. The engine note wasn't just stronger, it was cleaner, sharper, hungrier. The hesitation was gone. What in the actual hell do you think you're doing? Calder froze. There he was, Gunny Haskins. His voice carried all the subtlety of an artillery strike. The man marched across the tarmac, hat pulled low, jaw clenched, boots sending dust clouds into orbit. Every mechanic within earshot suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Calder shut down the engine. Silence fell. "Sir, you're running up a fighter without a damn pilot sign-off?" Haskins barked. "And with the cowling off? And with the throttle practically ripped off its rods?" Calder swallowed hard. The gunny was as wide as a bulldozer and twice as loud. "Yes, Gunny. I was testing a correction for what?" Haskins snapped. "For the manufacturer's recommended tolerances. For a system that's been audited by men with more degrees than you've had hot meals." Calder bit his tongue. He knew better than to bristle. Gunny Haskins stopped 3 feet from him, staring at the disassembled tools, the modified jet. On the workbench, the open maintenance manual with handwriting in the margins. His expression shifted. Suspicion, then curiosity, then something like concern. "What did you do to my airplane, Corporal?" Calder inhaled. The hesitation. I think I eliminated it." Haskins blinked, then blinked again. "Show me." The gunny climbed onto the wing, crouching over the carburetor like a hawk inspecting prey. It checked every bolt and hose. It sniffed the fittings. It tugged the linkage. No mechanic alive wanted to face a gunny's stare if something exploded under his supervision. Haskins motioned. "Start it." Calder obeyed. The engine roared back to life. Haskins leaned in so close his shirt rippled in the exhaust blasts. "Advance the throttle," he said calmly. Calder pushed it. The engine responded instantly. Haskins raised an eyebrow. Again. Calder slammed it open. Instant bite. No sag. Again. Same result. The gunny leaned back, studying Calder, with a new expression, not anger, not approval, but dangerous interest. What exactly did you change? Calder explained the modifications in detail, the wider jet, the adjusted stroke length, the reshaped aperture. Haskins listened without interrupting. When he finished, the gunny stood silently for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his teeth. Corporal, if this works in the air, you understand you've just violated at least 6 procedural regulations. Yes, gunny. And if it doesn't work, someone dies. Yes, gunny. Haskins stared at him, then nodded once. Get Lieutenant Mason, he's taking it up. Calder blinked. Mason, he's one of our best. Exactly, Haskins said. If this mod kills a pilot, it won't be because he made a mistake. Lieutenant Jack Mason swaggered toward the Corsair, 15 minutes later, helmet under one arm, green under his mustache. You boys cooked up something spicy? He asked. Calder kept his mouth shut. Haskins did not. This plane may behave differently. Don't yank the throttle until you're clear. Mason wiggled his eyebrows. I like different. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and flickered the magnetos. The engine roared back to life with that same predatory sharpness. Calder felt his stomach twist. What if the mixture ran too rich at altitude? What if cylinder fouling kicked in? What if the added surge snapped a prop governor pin? What if Mason waved? Calder stepped back. The Corsair began to taxi. Every mechanic on the line watched, wrenches dangling from motionless hands. The plane turned at the runway threshold, paused. Then Mason throttled up, hard. The Corsair lunged forward as if hurled by a catapult. No hesitation, no bog, no torque dip. Calder's eyes widened. Haskins muttered, Damn. The Corsair lifted off the ground with a smoothness usually reserved for test pilots and angels. Mason climbed steeply. Steeper, steeper. Normally, a Corsair would bark, cough, grumble its way through such an aggressive climb. This one didn't. It screamed upward like it had something to prove. Haskins grabbed the ground radio mic. Viper 2, how's she handling? Static. Then Mason's voice cut through. Holy hell. That wasn't a complaint. That was, oh. She jumps, Mason said. Throttle response is instant. No delay. No sag. She pulls like a bear with a lit firecracker under its tail. Calder felt the air leave his lungs. Mason continued, I'm gonna try a quick drop dive. Haskins stiffened. Calder held his breath. The Corsair arsed up, rolled, and dove. Normally, pilots eased power up during recovery because the engine needed a second to spool cleanly and stabilize airflow. Mason didn't ease anything. He punched the throttle during the pullout. The engine bit instantly. The plane snapped level, climbing again like it had never lost energy. Mason's laughter crackled over the radio. Boys, whatever you did to this bird, it works. It damn well works. When the Corsair landed, Mason rolled to a stop and climbed down with a grin so wide it nearly cut his face in half. A clapped Calder on the shoulder. This thing fights now. It doesn't wait for permission. Haskins shooed him away, then turned to Calder. Corporal, the gunny said, you understand we are now in possession of an illegal modification that makes the aircraft safer, more lethal, and more pilot-friendly. Calder swallowed. Yes, gunny. Haskins leaned closer. And you understand that if we tell command, they may ground every aircraft on the island until they investigate? Yes, gunny, but if we don't tell them, and another mechanic tries to replicate this without your precision, we might kill someone. Calder hesitated. Yes, gunny. Haskins nodded. Then here's what's going to happen. He pointed a finger in Calder's face. You are going to write down. Every single step you took, every measurement, every filed edge, every clearance tolerance. Yes, Gunny. And then we are going to test this modification on 3 more Corsairs. Yes, Gunny. And if all 3 pass, we will present the findings to the squadron, Co. as a recommended safety update. Calder blinked. Safety? The Gunny smirked. Nobody gets mad if you tell them you're saving pilots' lives. Over the next 48 hours, Calder and 2 selected mechanics rebuilt 3 more carburetors with the modified jets. Each test flight repeated the same result. No hesitation, no lag, no throttle dip, just raw, immediate bite. By the 3rd successful test, even the skeptics were running out of objections. Lieutenant Mason loudly declared that flying an unmodified Corsair felt like kicking a mule compared to riding a stallion. Word spread fast, too fast. Pilots began hovering around the maintenance tents like hungry dogs around a butcher shop. What's Calder cooking up? Did you hear Mason's climb rate yesterday? Just give me whatever he's giving them. Gunny Haskins had to physically move pilots away with a wrench. When the squadron commander Major Donovan summoned Calder and Haskins, everyone feared the worst. Donovan was strict, decisive, and respected. He didn't entertain nonsense. He also didn't tolerate rule-breaking. He closed the tent flap behind them. Gentlemen, I flew Mason's bird this morning. Dead silence. Donovan placed his cap on the table. You have improved the Corsair. Calder's jaw dropped. Donovan continued. You've done what the manufacturer, the stateside engineers, and a dozen test pilots did not. He fixed Calder with a staring drill of steel-gray eyes. Keep doing it. Calder blinked. Sir, modify every plane in the squadron. Sir, the manuals. Screw the manuals, Donovan said. We're fighting a war, not running a... Calder nodded slowly, stunned. Donovan leaned closer. And, Corporal? Yes, sir. Don't breathe a word of this to any other unit. The Navy already thinks we're too reckless. No need to prove them right. The true test came 3 days later. A patrol of 4 Corsairs intercepted 9 Cerros near Bougainville. Normally, that fight would end in a frantic dive for home. Not this time. Lieutenant Mason, flying the first fully modified Corsair, found himself in a vertical chase with a Zero that should have outclimbed him. But every time Mason shoved the throttle forward, the Corsair snapped upward with instant force. No delay, no sag, no hesitation. The Zero pilot misjudged the climb rate, expecting the usual Corsair lag. He stalled. Mason didn't. One burst from the 50 cals ended the fight. When the patrol returned, the radio logs buzzed with the same message. The Corsairs are jumping now. Throttle bite is immediate. Calder's fix works. Within a week, every plane in the squadron had the modification. Within a month, neighboring squadrons started hearing rumors. Within 3 months, the manufacturer sent a team to investigate why this unit's Corsairs were outperforming identically built aircraft on other islands. Gunny Haskins made sure all carburetors were returned to regulation settings the day before the inspection. Calder never said a word. Neither did Donovan. Neither did Mason. The squadron's advantage remained a secret between men who trusted each other more than paperwork. Years later, when the war ended, Calder returned home. He never bragged about the modification. He never spoke on record. He never asked for recognition. But the pilots remembered. They remembered it the first time they pushed the throttle, and the Corsair answered like it finally wanted to win the fight as much as they did. They remembered living through battles that the old hesitation would have turned fatal. They remembered how a quiet, grease-stained corporal saved more lives with a filed, brass jet than some generals saved with entire battle plans. And although no manual ever acknowledged his work, every pilot who survived knew the Corsair didn't become the most feared naval fighter of the Pacific because of its wings. It became feared because it finally learned how to fight back the instant. Its pilots asked thanks to one mechanic who refused to accept good enough. The night after Calder's modification proved itself in combat, the mood on the atoll changed in a way no one could miss. Pilots walked a little taller. Mechanics worked with a little more pride. Even the salt-stained winds rolling off the surf seemed to carry a new kind of electricity. But for Calder, the satisfaction lasted only a few hours, because victory has a way of drawing attention, and attention, especially in wartime aviation, was dangerous. 2 mornings later, as Calder finished torque-checking the intake manifold on a Corsair, a shadow fell across the wing route. He glanced up. A stranger stood below him, tall, crisp uniform, clean boots that had clearly never tasted Pacific sand, and a neat clipboard clutched like a badge of authority. His insignia gleamed. Lieutenant Commander John Randall, U.S. Navy Technical Evaluation Division. Calder's heart sank. Randall offered a polite smile. "You must be Corporal Calder." His tone was friendly, too friendly. Calder nodded, forcing casualness into his voice. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" Randall tapped his clipboard. "Just here to confirm some performance reports. Word is, your Corsairs are climbing better than factory specification. Quite a feat." Calder wiped grease on his sleeve, playing dumb. Maybe the pilots are just getting better, sir." Randall smiled again, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Or maybe the mechanics are trying some unofficial things." Calder's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, a gravel rough voice cut in. "Everything we do here is according to regulation." Gunny Haskins stepped into view like a battleship blocking a rowboat. He crossed his arms, boots planted wide, jaw set in its default expression, controlled hostility. Randall gave an unbothered nod. "I'm sure it is, Gunny. I'm just here to check data. That's all." Haskins jerked a thumb toward the command tent. "Then go check it over there. My men have work to do." Randall hesitated, then backed off, turning toward the tent with that same polite, venomous smile. Calder exhaled slowly. Haskins didn't look at him. "Finish up. Then meet me in tent 3. We need to talk." Inside tent 3, the fan whined weakly and flies circled the single bare bulb. Haskins sat on an ammo crate, arms folded, eyes sharp. He didn't yell, which scared Calder even more. "Calder," he said quietly, "that man is here because someone filed a performance anomaly report." Calder frowned. "The pilots wouldn't." "No," Haskins snapped. "But maintenance logs don't lie, and Donovan had to file the combat results. So, now the Navy wants to know why fainting goats are suddenly outrunning racehorses." Calder sat on a crate opposite him. "What do we do?" Haskins tugged at his mustache, a sign he was thinking at full throttle. "We stall. We keep Randall away from the carburetors. We keep him occupied with paperwork. And, most importantly, no more modifications until he leaves." Calder nodded. But Haskins wasn't done. "Listen to me carefully. If Randall discovers what you did, we're not talking reprimand. We're talking grounding the entire squadron until they rip apart every engine." Calder stared at the dirt floor. "And Mason's kills, the patrol results, they'll credit the pilots. Not you." "That's not the point," Haskins grumbled. "The point is keeping men alive, and that means we keep Randall out of this." He leaned in. "And that means you keep your head down." But Randall wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. Over the next 2 days, he prowled the flight line like a vulture with a degree in thermodynamics. He asked questions too many. He hovered around engines, took notes, measured climb angles, and requested fuel samples, spark plug readings, even exhaust residue scrapings. Calder and Haskins deflected everything they could, but Randall was patient and persistent. Worse, Pilots started whispering, "What's that Navy guy sniffing around for? What's he want with Calder? Is the fix going away?" Mason joked that if Randall got any closer to his Corsair, he'd start charging him rent. But underneath the jokes, everyone felt it. The edge they'd gained, the edge that saved lives, was under threat. Calder worked late every night, rechecking every carburetor to make sure there was no visible sign of modification. He cleaned tool marks, removed scratches, and tuned tolerances until the engines looked fresh off the assembly line. But Randall wasn't stupid. He knew something was different, and he was getting closer. Everything began to unravel on the fourth evening. Calder was locking the tool cage when Private Jenkins, a young, nervous mechanic, burst in, face pale. "Calder, I screwed up." Calder stiffened. "What happened?" Jenkins swallowed hard. "Randall cornered at me by the wash rack. Said he needed to check the carburetor on Viper 6. I told him he couldn't. He said he had clearance. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe he really did so. I let him look." Calder's breath froze. "You what?" Jenkins winced. "It didn't open anything," but he looked at the throttle linkage, and the jet housing, and the accelerator pump, and then he scribbled something down and walked away. Calder felt his pulse hammering. This was it. The secret was cracking open. Jenkins looked ready to faint. "I am sorry, Calder. I didn't." Calder forced himself to breathe. "It's not your fault. He tricked you." But inside, he knew. Randall was closing in. The next morning, Calder reported to the CO's tent as ordered. Inside, Major Donovan stood behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back. Randall stood beside him, clipboard ready. "Corporal Calder," Donovan said calmly. "Lieutenant Commander Randall tells me there may be undocumented alterations to our carburetors." Calder's heart dropped. "Sir, Randall stepped forward. "I've reviewed throttle response data, climb metrics, and engine performance from 3 aircraft. All exceed factory tolerance by margins, too specific to be coincidence." Flipped a page. "And Private Jenkins informed Mason on standard tool marks around the fuel metering jet housings." Donovan looked at Calder. "Is there anything you want to say?" The tent felt smaller. The air felt thicker. Calder could lie. He could deny everything. But Randall wasn't guessing. He had evidence. Not enough to convict, but enough to demand a full teardown. And if that happened, the squadron would lose its edge. Pilots would die. Calder's jaw tightened. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe the performance changes are due to meticulous maintenance and consistent tuning." A half-truth. Randall wasn't satisfied. "And the tool marks?" he pressed. "The jets don't show factory machining patterns." Calder met Randall's eyes. "Sir, these planes take a beating. We do what we need to keep them alive." Randall's gaze sharpened. "That's not an answer." Calder opened his mouth. But Donovan raised a hand. "That's enough." He dismissed them both. But the look he gave Calder said everything. The secret was one day away from being exposed. Fate intervened the next morning. A Japanese raid swept over the atoll. At dawn, 2,000 aircraft, diving out of the clouds, with bombs and cannon, fire screaming in their wake. Pilots sprinted for their Corsairs. Mechanics threw themselves into trenches. Sirens wailed. Explosions reaped palm trees out of the ground. Mason's Corsair, one of the modified ones, was already fueled and armed. He vaulted into the cockpit, yelling for someone to pull the chocks. Calder didn't hesitate. He grabbed the wheel chocks and hurled them aside as the engine roared to life. The second Mason was clear. 3 more modified. Corsairs began starting up. Randall stood frozen near the hangar, staring upward as Ceros swept overhead. Calder grabbed his arm. "Sir, get to the shelter." But Randall didn't move. He watched the Corsairs spool their throttles, watched the instant bite, The perfect response, the way the engine snarled with zero hesitation. His expression changed. Confusion, then realization, then something else. Respect. Mason was airborne first. His shot upward so sharply it looked like the sky pulled him in. Two Ceros tried to intercept. He throttled hard, no hesitation, and rolled into a vertical spiral. They couldn't follow. In seconds, the first Cero exploded in a burst of orange flame. The second tried to disengage. It never had a chance. Mason was on it like a hawk, thanks to the instant engine bite that let him sling the Corsair around without energy lag. Other Corsairs joined the fight, the modified throttle response letting them yank away from danger or pounce with split-second precision. Randall watched it all. Watched pilots survive moves that should have killed them. Watched aircraft maneuver in ways the Navy had long insisted they could not. Watched Calder's illegal modification save the squadron from massacre. By the time the last Zero fled, the atoll was smoking, cratered but alive, and the squadron was intact. After the raid, Calder found Randall standing alone near the wreckage of the supply shack, staring out at the sea. Calder braced himself. "Sir, about the carburetors." Randall raised a hand. "Corporal, stop." He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "I saw the climb rates today. I saw the throttle work. I saw what it allowed your men to do." Calder swallowed. Randall continued. "And I also saw the standard Corsairs try to get airborne. They struggled. They hesitated. Two barely made it off the ground." He stepped closer. "Your modification saved this squadron." Calder blinked. Randall lowered his voice. "I'm supposed to file a report. If I, though, every aircraft will be grounded." He looked toward the smoking runway. "And next time, we won't be so lucky." Silence hung between them. Calder spoke first. "Sir, what will you do?" Randall exhaled, then tore the pages from his clipboard, one by one. It dropped them into the burning remains of a fuel crate. The paper curled, browned, and turned to ash. Randall looked at Calder. "What you've done is unofficial, unauthorized, irregular." Then he extended his hand. "But it's the right thing." Calder shook it. Randall nodded once. "You keep your secret. I'll file a clean report." Then he walked away, leaving Calder stunned. Major Donovan called a meeting that evening. The entire squadron, pilots and mechanics, gathered under the mess tent lights. Donovan stepped forward. "I know some of you have been worried about outside interest in our performance." Eyes flickered toward Randall, who stood quietly at the back. "But after today," Donovan continued, "it's clear our squadron survives because we trust each other, because we protect each other, because we innovate when others hesitate." He looked toward Calder. "Because some men are brave where no one can see it." Calder felt his face flush. Donovan raised his voice. "So from this day on, the carburetor enhancement stays. It stays quiet. It stays inside this unit. And it stays because it saves lives." The crowd erupted with applause. Mechanics slapped Calder on the back. Pilots shook his hand. Mason bear-hugged him, lifting him off the ground. Even Randall nodded from the back, a small, respectful bow of the head. In the following months, the squadron earned the highest kill-to-loss ratio in the region. The reason? No one ever officially recorded it. No one photographed it. No one sent a memo. But everyone knew. They won because their Corsairs didn't wait. They reacted the instant a pilot needed them to. They won because one quiet, marine mechanic refused to let hesitation be the reason another pilot didn't come home. And although history books never mention it, the men who were there remembered. They knew the truth. The Pacific Air War was changed, not just by daring pilots, but by a small brass jet, filed by hand, in a sweltering tent on a lonely atoll. The next morning began, like every other, on the atoll, humid, windless, and smelling faintly of salt, avgas, and wet canvas. But for the pilots of VMF 214, something was different the moment they stepped onto the flight line. The Corsairs sounded wrong. Not bad, not dangerously, just different. A sharper bark at idle, a quicker cough when the throttle opened, a tighter, more eager rumble instead of the usual sluggish vibration. Captain Lewis noticed it first. He stopped mid-stride, one boot frozen above the sand, his eyes narrowing toward the blue-gray fighter idling 50 yards away. "That's not a stock," he muttered. Two other pilots turned. "It's Calder's line," someone said. And that was when Lewis's expression shifted, part concern, part curiosity, part, "This might get interesting." Because by now, rumors about Corporal Frank Calder had begun circulating like jungle whispers. The pilots didn't know the details, nobody did, but they knew something had changed. Their Corsairs were suddenly livelier during warm-up. The engines no longer hesitated when mechanics ran them through quick throttle checks. It was subtle, but real, and in a war, where the difference between life and death could be 1 second of hesitation, subtle mattered. Lewis walked toward Calder, who, as always, looked like he had spent the night sleeping inside an engine cowling. "You touched something, didn't you?" the captain asked. Calder didn't look up from the torque wrench in his hand. "Just tightened what was loose," he said plainly, "and loosened what was too tight," which meant everything and nothing. Lewis folded his arms. "Is it safe?" Calder gave a slow nod. "Safe as anything out here." It wasn't a technical explanation, but it was honest. Lewis took a long breath, exhaled, and climbed into his Corsair. Because in combat, pilots trusted 3 things: their training, their instincts, and when it came down to it, their mechanics. Calder had never given them reason not to trust him. Minutes later, the squadron taxied out, and for the first time in weeks, the Corsairs didn't waddle, they strode, like predators walking toward the edge of a cliff, ready to leap. The tower crackled. Black sheep, cleared for takeoff, runway 21. Lewis pushed the throttle forward, and that's when he felt it. No hesitation, no lazy rumble, no half-second lag while the supercharger tried to catch up. The Corsair surged, actually surged like a living creature kicked awake. The tail came up, earlier than expected. The wings steadied quicker. The nose stopped trying to wander off into the bushes. Lewis let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. The plane didn't feel like an Ensign Eliminator anymore. It felt finally like the carrier killer it was always meant to be. Behind him, the other Corsairs echoed his reaction. Their takeoff runs were cleaner, straighter, faster. Even Lieutenant Harris, who usually needed half the runway and a prayer, lifted off smoothly, gaining altitude with far less wobble. By the time they regrouped over the ocean, Lewis's radio was alive with chatter. "Is your throttle response quicker? Feels like someone shave 100 pounds off this thing. My climb rate, Jesus, this is different." But Lewis cut them off. "Save it. We'll see if it matters where it counts." Because today they were escorting bombers toward a Japanese-held island only 80 miles away. The path was short. The enemy response would be fast. And every minute closer meant more. Ceros swarming up from hidden fields carved into the jungle. And the Japanese pilots? They were no fools. They knew the Corsair's weakness. They would attack during climb. Always. Lewis leveled it off with the bomber formation and signaled his wingmen into position. 10 minutes later, they saw them thin silver needles rising from the green jungle canopy, angling upward with the sun glinting off their wings. Ceros. A lot of them. Lewis tightened his harness. "Here they come. Eyes sharp. Keep your energy up." The Ceros did what they always did, charging upward, aggressively, trying to catch the Americans during the vulnerable transition from climb to cruise. But this time, the timing was wrong, because Calder had changed the timing. Literally. The Corsairs weren't lagging today. They weren't hesitating. They weren't sluggishly coughing their way from low power to combat power settings. Louis saw the first zero break toward his bomber group. It rolled left, pulled back on the stick, and shoved the throttle forward. And the Corsair bit. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.